137 meters long, 23 meters wide, 3 full floors. These were the dimensions that God gave to Noah. Direct, clear, and supernaturally specific. The divine order left no room for doubt. Make yourself an ark. And with that voice, one of the greatest works ever accomplished by human hands began. The Bible reveals the size of the ark, its materials, and its purpose. But to transform that order into wood, beams, and structure, Noah had to face gigantic challenges. Challenges that the text doesn't detail, but that any builder of the time would understand. And it all starts with what many ignore: the land. A structure that is 137 meters long cannot be erected just anywhere. It requires ample, firm, stable space away from dangerous slopes and near cypress forests that would serve as raw material. So imagine Noah walking across the land, analyzing the soil, observing the firmness of the earth, the proximity of the trees, the accessibility. No machines, no engineers, no maps, just discernment, practical wisdom, and faith. And when he found the ideal location, he began the first stage. And it was anything but glorious. Remove large stones to uproot deep roots. Level every meter. Compacting the soil to support tons of wood. All with simple tools, but with a determination driven by the Word. But there was something that made the job even more challenging in the pre-flood world: the constant moisture rising from the earth. The Bible explains that a mist was rising from the earth and watering the whole surface of the ground. Genesis 2:6. This means that the soil was often moist by nature, and damp soil can turn to mud. Tools sink. Wood absorbs moisture. The ground becomes vulnerable. So Noah probably needed to dig small channels around the construction site, creating simple diversions so that the natural groundwater wouldn't saturate the work area. It wasn't rain falling from the sky, it was the earth itself releasing moisture. While he was doing this, people walked by and watched. Some people laughed, others whispered, "What's the point of preparing such a gigantic plot of land?" But Noah did not answer, because he didn't build using human logic. He built by following divine instruction. And when the ground finally became firm, flat, and dry enough, a new challenge arose before him: the collection of wood for a colossal structure. The Bible says, "Make the ark of cypress wood." And cypress trees were not small trunks. They were enormous, sturdy, heavy trees, ideal for a project of that magnitude. To fell a tree like that with rudimentary tools, only with strength, patience, and persistence. Take down hundreds? It was a process that required daily discipline. Blow after blow, trunk after trunk, Noah and his sons toiled until the crash of the falling tree echoed through the forest. But the service didn't end there. Moving a giant tree trunk to the construction site required skill. Without wheels, not enough animals, no machines, the solution was the same one used by ancient peoples: wooden rollers. Smaller logs were placed under the larger log. Using ropes and levers, they slowly pulled, moving tons of wood a few meters at a time. As the log moved forward, the rear rollers were repositioned to the front. This is it. Tiring. Risky. But each log carried was another step in building what God had ordained. And Noah continued, because those who have received instruction from God do not work by what they see. They work by what they believe. And while all this was happening, the residents nearby saw this unusual activity. men carrying enormous logs towards a gigantic plot of land. It was natural that many would mock, that others would doubt. But none of this deterred Noah, because he was not motivated by human eyes, but by the instruction that came from God. As the wood piled up on the site, it was time to begin the most complex part of the entire project. Not just cutting and transporting, but to erect a colossal structure who would need to remain steadfast during the greatest storm in human history. For the ark to remain firm, upright, and sturdy, Noah would need to start from the base, from the backbone of the entire vessel, the keel. The Bible doesn't describe the process, but any ancient builder would understand that a structure of that size required an extremely long and robust central beam, capable of supporting the entire weight of the hull, the 3 decks, and the tons of cargo that would come later. But there was one detail that could not be ignored. No tree, no matter how tall, could reach 137 meters in length. This means that Noah needed to join several giant beams, trunk after trunk, creating a continuous, straight, and solid line. A task that required skill, precision, and patience. These beams were cut and fitted with wooden joints, something known since the most ancient civilizations. Male and female systems that, when well made, became as sturdy as entire structures. And to secure these joints, stakes and pegs of hardwood were inserted, creating points of union strong enough to hold everything together in violent storms. When the keel was ready, an impressive moment unfolded before Noah: the need to erect the ribs from the ark. The ribs were arched beams that rose from the sides and gave shape to the hull. The ribs needed to be fitted together precisely. Therefore, Noah and his sons did what the ancient builders had mastered very well. They created carefully sculpted, custom-made fittings that allowed the beams to tilt and arch naturally as they were attached to the keel. And as these ribs rose up beside the keel, the shape of the ark finally began to emerge before their eyes. Now, imagine the scene. Huge, heavy beams being lifted by levers, thick ropes, and sheer human strength. Noah and his sons pulling, adjusting, correcting angles, observing every inch. Because if one rib were tilted too far, the entire structure would lose its balance. Therefore, they probably used ropes stretched from end to end as guidelines. They used stones as plumb lines to ensure verticality, and they repeated the process dozens of times. When the skeleton of the ark with it began to take shape, the view was going to be impressive. A gigantic wooden structure emerging where there had never been a sea, the size of a modern building, but made only with simple tools and human hands. And then came a crucial moment to seal the ark. Because a beautiful structure is not enough, it needed to be waterproof. And God was straightforward about it. You shall cover the ark inside and out with pitch. This detail is profound. Bitumen, a resin derived from the earth, needed to be boiled, thickened, and applied while still hot, creating a hard and resistant film. But applying it only externally wouldn't be enough. Over time, wood absorbs moisture, and any infiltration could destroy everything. So Noah and his sons spent days, perhaps weeks, covering every crack, every joint, every crevice, both inside and out. Each layer needed to dry before another was applied, and any mistake could jeopardize the entire project. Finally, when the last part was sealed and hardened, the ark was no longer just a wooden structure. It was an airtight shelter, designed to withstand something that had never happened before in the history of mankind. And the next step would be just as important as the external structure. Organize the interior to house living creatures. The Bible reveals a fundamental detail: you shall make compartments in the ark. The Hebrew term used, my vagina, literally means nests, cells, small divisions. In other words, the ark was not an open shed. It was made up of smaller sections, carefully planned to maintain order, security, and stability during the flood. And here is an important theological point. The Bible doesn't describe the layout. It only states that there was 1 3-floor sand compartments. Based on this, we can imagine what would be logical, practical, and possible for Noah. To maintain the vessel's balance, the most sensible approach would be to organize the animals by weight and size. Lower level, heavy animals. Elephants, hippos, large bovines. This would keep the center of gravity low, preventing dangerous oscillations. Intermediate floor, medium-sized animals. Lions, bears, deer, larger domestic animals. Upper floor, birds and smaller animals. Lighter weight, less impact on balance, and closer to the ventilation system. This division does not contradict the Bible and is entirely consistent with such a large structure. The compartments were essential. Without them, predators could attack prey. Animals could get hurt. There would be total chaos inside. Diseases would spread rapidly. So Noah probably built simple but strong enough inner walls to keep each species in its own space. These walls needed to fit together well, without compromising the integrity of the hull. Bearing in mind that each piece of wood added weight and needed to be planned. Ventilation. The Bible mentions, "You shall make a cubit-sized opening above it." This indicates a kind of long, continuous window below the roof. But to ventilate 3 entire floors, Noah probably did this. Small, protected side openings. External protrusions that prevented water from entering. Internal corridors for air circulation. Everything within the logic of the pre-flood environment. Without adequate ventilation, the gases produced by the animals would be deadly. Food storage. A year's worth of food for all creatures meant an enormous amount of supplies. The Bible says, "You will take food with you for yourself and for them." This included full grains, nuts, roots, water stored in jugs and containers. Therefore, entire areas inside the ark needed to be dedicated solely to food, stored in an organized manner and protected from moisture. The ark was more than just a ship. It was a floating city with complete logistics. Waste disposal, plausible possibilities, slightly sloping floors, simple drainage channels, small side openings just for draining liquids, manual collection of solids, as was common in the ancient world. And when each space, each division, each corridor was finished, Noah realized that the work was reaching its most critical point of all. At the door, a gigantic opening, large enough to allow animals of all sizes to enter, and at the same time strong enough not to compromise the entire structure. The door would be the most vulnerable point of the ark, and also the most symbolic point, because the Bible says something extraordinary. The Lord shut the door. Man built it, but God sealed it. Among all the elements of the ark, none attracted more attention than at the door. The Bible clearly states, "And you will place a door beside it." Genesis 6:16. To prevent the enormous opening from compromising the structure, Noah likely installed thick beams around the frame, diagonal bracing, strong and deep joints, high-strength wood on the edges, everything to ensure that the door did not become a point of collapse. And remember, Noah didn't have enough metal to create huge hinges like the modern ones, so the most plausible system would be a vertical pivot. A large, reinforced wooden axle on the side of the door allowed it to rotate powerfully, yet function stably. Here is a valuable theological point. The Bible says, "And the Lord shut the door." Genesis 7:16. I.e. Noah built, God sealed. Before the animals arrived, Noah must have walked around inside the ark, testing beams, checking if the bitumen has hardened completely, checking for cracks, reinforcing ribs, assessing the weight of provisions already loaded, listening to the sounds of compressed wood. In large wooden structures, it speaks. Range, cracks, settles in. And Noah, with the experience gained over the years of construction, would know how to identify if something was wrong. And then, something supernatural happened. The Bible is explicit. The animals came to Noah. They were not captured. They were not taken by force. They didn't arrive randomly. They came. It seemed like an orchestrated movement, as if an invisible hand were guiding each species. Imagine a scene: pairs of animals emerging from between trees, birds landing near the entrance, wild creatures walking calmly alongside prey, reptiles crawling in the exact direction, puppies following instincts they haven't learned, and everyone positioning themselves in order, without chaos, without confusion, without attacks. It was proof that this was not just a human project. It was a divine act happening before the very eyes of Noah's family. When everyone else went in, animals, birds, reptiles, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their daughters-in-law went in too. 8 people. And then the work was completed. Faith had been obeyed. And now the most challenging part began. How did Noah and his family survive inside the ark during the days of the flood? With the door closed by God's own hand, a different kind of silence fell over the ark. Outside, the world continued, as if nothing had happened. Inside, everything was ready. Animals housed, compartments organized, food stored, the structure sealed and sturdy. It was the beginning of something that had never happened before in the history of mankind. The Bible describes this moment with solemn words. In the 600th year of Noah's life, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7:11. This indicates groundwater exploding to the surface, internal pressures released, gigantic volumes of water gushing out forcefully, earthquakes, and deep ruptures beneath the earth. Noah's family felt the ark shake, not from the water above, but from the violent movement of the earth below. Then, something even more extraordinary happened. The floodgates of heaven were opened. It was the first rain in history. And not just any rain, thick drops, increasing volume, deafening noise on the wood, thunder echoing, flashes tearing across the sky. The ark, which had been motionless until then, began to feel the touch of the first waters accumulating around it. Imagine the neighbors who laughed at Noah, those who called the ark madness. The Bible doesn't describe his feelings, but it's easy to imagine. Cries for the unknown rain, astonishment at the rapidly rising waters, people running around without understanding, panic in the face of something that had never happened before. The faith that once seemed like madness was now becoming the only refuge. The water kept rising, 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 until the hull, heavy and sturdy, began to float. For Noah and his family, this must have been an indescribable feeling. The wood creaking, the ground vibrating, the initial balance, the sound of water hitting the side, the ark detaching itself from the earth for the first time. That vessel, built over decades, was finally fulfilling its purpose. The ark was not guided by sails, oars, or rudders. She didn't need that. She was in God's hands. The Bible describes, "The waters prevailed and increased greatly on the earth." Genesis 7:19. This means disappearing mountains, submerged cities, uprooted trees, the old life being erased before the eyes of Noah's family. From the inside, the ark seemed like a world of its own. Outside, everything was dying. Inside, God preserved life. The contrast was stark. How long did the rain last? The sound of the rain ceased after 40 days, but the flood was far from over. The Bible describes, "The waters prevailed upon the earth for 150 days." Genesis 7:24. Even without rain, the waters continued to rise and move, covering mountains, plains, valleys, and everything that existed before. Inside the ark, time seemed to stand still. There was work to be done every day. Feeding the animals, clean the compartments, check the beams, reinforce joints, monitor stability, to pray, wait. And then, after long months of waiting, the biblical narrative reveals a decisive moment. And God remembered Noah. Genesis 8:1. The Bible says that God sent a wind over the earth, and the waters began to recede. Slowly, day after day, the level began to decrease, until the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis 8:4. After months of partial darkness, Noah opened the upper window. For the first time since the beginning of the flood, fresh air rushed in with force. Natural light filled the interior of the ark. But he still had no way of knowing if the land was ready. So he made a logical and wise decision: released a crow. Then he released a dove. The dove returned because it could not find a place to perch. The world was still underwater. A week later, Noah tried again. The dove returned, but this time it carried an olive leaf. It was the first sign of a new beginning. Another week has passed. Noah released the dove a third time, and it did not return. The earth was finally beginning to become habitable again. After more than a year inside the ark, God spoke again. "Come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and your sons' wives with you." Genesis 8:16. And Noah obeyed. The door, the very same one that God had closed, was now open. An intense light flooded the interior. The animals began to leave, species by species, following their instincts, dispersing throughout the new land. The whole family set foot on solid ground for the first time in many months. The smell of wet earth, the pure air, the profound silence. Everything was new. Nothing from the ancient world had survived. But God's grace preserved enough life for a fresh start. As soon as he left the ark, Noah did something symbolic, powerful, memorable. He erected an altar to the Lord. There, among rocks, dried mud, and the beginning of a restored landscape, Noah offered a sacrifice. The Bible describes how God was pleased with the pleasing aroma and made a promise. Never again will I destroy all life with water. And then he put a visible sign in the sky, the rainbow, an eternal covenant, reminding humanity that, even in judgment, God preserves a remnant, sustains life, and opens a path of faith. With the flood over, the ark had fulfilled its purpose. Now a new chapter was beginning. Noah and his family would repopulate the earth. Nations would arise from the sons of Noah. The world would gain new cycles, seasons, and limits established by God. The story of redemption would continue. From that vessel would be born all of post-diluvian humanity. And the ark, a symbol of obedience, faith, and salvation, remained as a testament that God always rescues those who trust in His voice. If you've made it this far, you've already realized the ark was not just a boat. It was an act of faith placed in wood. It was salvation preserved on 3 floors. It was God's response to sin and at the same time proof of God's love for life. But Noah's story doesn't end at the ark. There is much more to it than that. The restart of humanity, the new alliance, the generations that came after, and how all of this connects to God's greater plan. Click on the video next to this text now to find out what happened after the flood and how this shaped the entire biblical story.